Before I introduce my colleagues here on stage, I just want to give a sincere thanks to the numerous Vashon neighbors who have donated their financial support to bring this lecture and piano recital series to VCA. These generous neighbors of ours are Kathy and Wally Arnold, Steve Jensen and Mark Grace, Winnie Mitchell and Ralph Frabel, John Gordon Hill and Ellen Hill, Jeff Thurrow and Carrie Barrett, Susan and Bill Reeves, Amy Huggins, and John and Beth DeGroon. Thank you for making this possible. Can you give me... If we can have some lights on the stage while I introduce the musicians. Sitting at the piano is Albert Cano Smit, who audience members of VCA are familiar with. Albert has been here before. He has been performing throughout the United States and Europe. This time last year in April, he performed the Rachmaninoff Fourth Piano Concerto with his Seattle Symphony Orchestra to great acclaim. He is also our solo artist for tomorrow evening, but he will be co-hosting with me tonight because luckily enough, Albert is from Catalonia, where most of these musicians and these works of art came from. Then we have over to your right is Holly Johnson, originally from San Clemente, California. Holly studied voice at Cornish College of the Arts. In 2004, she pursued her studies in Indonesia to explore the local art forms at colleges across Indonesian archipelago. While studying traditional Sudanese song on the island of Java, Holly met her husband, Olan Durham, and then in 2009, Holly and Oi made Vashon their home. And then next to Holly is Christopher Overstreet, a well-known pianist here on Vashon Island for his solo work, for his work with bands and musicals, as well as one of the renowned piano teachers on the island. After graduating from Cornish College, Christopher and his wife, Abby Jensen, made Vashon their home. Later in the program, Holly will sing 4 songs, or canciones, with Christopher accompanying. The art of the song is the marriage of poetry and melody. And I think it's one of the most underrated works of art in idioms in the music world. And so it's always a pleasure for me to be able to have a fantastic local soprano here and pianist so that we can get a taste of the art song from the Spanish composers. So what you are seeing here is from my iPhone about 2 years ago, and this is the interior of the Palau de Música, or the Palace of Music, built in Barcelona around 1915 by the Spanish architect Montaner. And as you can see, it's extremely opulent. It's a combination of Art Nouveau, Stilo Modernisto. And here we see the proscenium of the stage, which those figures are supposed to be taken from various scenes of Wagner's opera. And it's surprising that there is a very big dramatic influence on Catalan music scene. Throughout tonight's lecture, I'll be handing the mic over to Albert, who will talk about the individual works before he performs them. There's no intermission in this lecture, so after an hour or so, and you need to get up and to leave the hall, I just ask that you walk out while I'm talking and not doing the music performance. Thank you, thank you. The next video we're seeing is, it's called the Casa Güell. Güell was a very successful textile industrialist in Catalonia. And with his wealth, he built some very famous places in Barcelona. Park Güell is a beautiful park, sort of like the first Disneyland, but with a Catalan flair. His private home, which you're seeing the interior sort of huge lobby, which is like 3 stories with a pipe organ. There's all these inlaid stone mosaics and beautifully cast bronze door handles, etc. And it is a testament to the sort of forward-looking industrialists of Catalonia, that they just didn't want to copy what they saw in London or in Paris, but they wanted to produce something that was unique to Barcelona and to Catalonia. Oops, sorry, I went ahead too far. Well, anyway, this map here, I'm not going to try and give you a whole history lesson tonight, but I think it's useful to know the huge changes that Spain had gone through leading up to the end of the 19th century. Before 1492, Spain was a collection of different kingdoms. In the south, the richest area with a very rich agriculture was under the rule of the Moors, who were Muslims originally from North Africa, who ruled for over 700 years this whole area and had a huge influence on Spanish culture, especially in the south. In 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, who were both king and queens of Aragon and Castilla, finally throw out the Moors, and Spain is, for the first time, united as one country. If you look over then to your right, it's a map of Spain in 100 years, around 1550. And with the discovery of the Americas, the discovery of the Philippines, and other territories, Spain becomes a world empire. And with that world empire, a huge amount of riches start to flow into Spain. With these riches, the Spanish Baroque takes off. And here on your left is a very classic Baroque altar in a Catholic church in Spain. Notice the double columns that are twisted, like Bernini's columns in St. Peter's, around the center tabernacle. This style was repeated throughout Spain and throughout Latin America, and it's called La Salamanca, which is where it was first constructed. The palace interior in the middle is actually the current palace of the Dukes of Alba, who became famous through marriages of various noble families. The very famous painting of the female nude by Goya was a Duchess of Alba. It is said that when the Dukes of Alba walked from Madrid to Sevilla, where they also have a huge palace, they never have to leave their property. And then to the right is an interior, actually in a Sicilian palace, which Spain ruled at that time. And it shows this incredible opulent taste that was really restricted to the ruling class and the church. I mean, you almost can get a sense of 18th century court life. And by the way, the court life of the Spanish throne in Madrid was extremely conservative, very, very tight lace and very strict, unlike the French court of Louis XIV and the Bourbons. So, let me get my connection to the screen going here. Okay, here we go. Back to a little bit more of the map. So this is a map of the world just before World War I. And if you notice where you had seen all the dark blue of the Spanish Empire, it's gone. And in Spain, by 1898, after the Spanish-American War, loses its last colony, which is Cuba, which was a very, very important colony since it provided tobacco and cotton and sugar, which made a lot of families in Spain quite wealthy. What's interesting at this time, 1890s, 1900, countries like Germany, Great Britain, and France have about 80% literacy. Spain at that time only had 30% literacy. And when you got into rural areas, especially in the South, it could be under 10%. After the loss of Cuba, there was a tremendous malaise politically in Spain. Eventually, a general takes over, acts as a dictatorship, but by the late 1920s, the dictatorship is thrown out. The king abdicates. This is a Bourbon dynasty that had been ruling since the early 1700s. He abdicates, and it's the birth of the Republic. Up till this time, in the late 1870s, 1880s, Madrid's political policy towards Catalonia was as we got to keep this rival city down. So they would not let Barcelona expand beyond its Gothic walls. For that reason, in the early 19th century, Barcelona was probably the most crowded, overpopulated cities in all of Western Europe. But after the change in policy in Madrid, Barcelona could tear down these walls and start to expand out. And if you've ever been to Barcelona, there's an area called the Eixample, which was a planned city, and it was a remarkable, remarkable piece of urban planning. This resurgence of Catalonia, both culturally and economically, makes it sort of the new center for Spain. So at this time, and these will be the major composers we will cover today. You have birth of the Spanish idiom, which had already become popular in France when Napoleon III took as a wife a very famous Spanish noble woman. And Spanish music became sort of the rage in France. And one of the great examples of that, of course, is Bizet's famous opera Carmen. But Debussy, Liszt, Ravel wrote the Spanish rhapsodies, wrote the Bolero. These are pieces all taking their cue from Spanish dance rhythms. However, it took a while for Spain's own composers to adopt as idiom their native music and their native harmonies. And this is best example with Isaac Albeniz, who was the first of them, followed by, just born a few years later, Enrique Granados. Both were incredible, talented concert pianists. And then the next generation would be Manuel de Falla, known very, very well for his Danza de Fuego and the Three-Cornered Hat. And probably a composer you're not too familiar with. He is the third generation Frederic Mompou. And Frederic would probably have had a much larger, well-known career, except that he was very much an introvert, very shy, could not have a public career, yet he was championed by Satie and Poulenc. At the same time, where these composers are all coming to Paris at one point in their life, they're not the only Spanish coming to Paris. This is the Belle Epoque. This is when Paris is like the cultural center of the world. And so you have here famous examples of works written exactly the same time as the Albeniz and Granados pieces that we'll be hearing later. Pablo Picasso, who spent a lot of his formative years in Barcelona. Juan Miró, who is from Barcelona, and Picasso's guitar player. Also other famous artists we can't ignore, of course, Juan Gris from Madrid and Salvador Dali. But everybody knew if you were going to make a career, you had to go to Paris. One thing that did not make any sense was for an architect to go to Paris because they had their own, but Barcelona certainly supported them. As I showed you earlier, the interior of the Palau de Música, which was, this is a great example of what we call estilo modernismo, or modern style. In Catalonia, it sort of mixes Romanesque. There is, when Catalonia was at its height in the early Middle Ages, it was its own country practically, and all throughout Catalonia are beautiful examples of Romanesque churches. And so they combine this with the Belle Epoque and the Art Nouveau. And then another very famous architect is Antonio Gaudí. The picture to your left is his Park Güell. And then to your right is famous apartment building Casa Milà. And as you can see, these, which millions of people flock to these buildings every year, but the craftsmanship, the stonemasonry, the forging, the tile work is a great display of the prosperous merchant and industrial class of Catalonia, who chose more of an avant-garde way to express themselves than other traditional 19th century styles. Then no better example of over-the-top design and engineering being produced in Catalonia was the luxury car Hispano Suiza, whose patents were used even by Rolls-Royce. Their airplane engine was dominant in World War I aircraft for the French and British. In 1931, their J12 limousine, probably the most expensive car to be bought at that time, had a 12-cylinder engine and speed up to 150 miles per hour. Yeah, today most cars have 4 cylinders, you know. Here we see the Hispano Suiza of 1915, luxury model. It's flamboyance to the extreme, but sometimes I hear that flamboyance to the extreme in Albeniz. And here we come to Isaac Albeniz. Just briefly, I mean, he had a very interesting life. He was born north of Barcelona in Gerona, but already by the age of 9, he was performing in public. And his father, as so many other fathers with talented pianist sons, took him with him whenever he traveled. So Albeniz, from an early age, was playing in Cuba, in Buenos Aires, and in the Americas. He had a tendency to embellish his own life history. He had this big story how he had studied under Liszt that we know from research now they never met. But back then, who could prove that? But it was, in fact, recognized by his contemporaries like Debussy and Ravel that he was a very, very excellent pianist, playing Chopin, Liszt, Beethoven, Bach. Debussy and Ravel were great supporters of Albeniz. They loved this very real Spanish character that he caught in his music. And what's interesting is to consider that most of Albeniz's music is probably familiar to you through the guitar, because most of his famous pieces have been transcribed to guitar. And guitarists owe a lot of their great classical literature to Albeniz, who, by the way, never played the guitar. Piano was his instrument. So it's sort of an interesting irony there. Albert's going to be playing selections from the Iberia Suite and the Suite Espagnole. And I'll let Albert explain the pieces more in depth, but probably something Albert's not going to mention because he doesn't want to boast, but some of the pieces of the Iberia Suite are considered some of the most difficult things a pianist could ever try and play in public. One pianist said that Albeniz really wrote this for 3 arms, not 2. And there are places where there's 3 staves, and a lot of places he doesn't tell you which hand to raise into that middle staff. It's a real tour de force. So let's raise the screen, and Albert will, not necessarily in this order of these pieces, but he'll be playing selections from the Suite Espanol and Iberia Suite.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And some of these, so for the sake of time, we'll hear three of these pieces, but I'll try to cover a little bit of both suites in general, because there's a lot of more great music to come. So it's true. It's funny now listening to Mike talk about Albeniz embellish his own life. I was thinking, which is, you, I love this because one learns things, even though I'm the Spaniard who's supposed to know this. It's true. He actually, one of the features in his music is that he embellishes every note with some sort of articulation mark or instruction or something. It's almost too much. Clearly, I mean, it's impossible to execute everything as it's written, but in a way, it's this extremely sort of lavish, fragrant, and beautiful language that it's like overflowing with inspiration, and it's trying to convey the spirit of the music with every possible tool, and to the extreme that it's almost too much. And that's also sort of the strength. I feel like with Albeniz, since he was like that in his life, I feel like there's almost no distance between his life and his music. It's sort of a very natural representation of his culture, of his personality, maybe, even though we never met him and we didn't know him. So hopefully the music will illustrate that a little bit. But going back to the point of the guitar, maybe with the exception of Iberia, the suite of Iberia actually has 4 books, and each has 3 pieces, and they're all based on a different location in Spain and with different dances and so forth. That probably none of those movements could be played on the guitar because it's very pianistic and it's very well written for the instrument, and it's very, very complex. But for most of his other music, if you even just Google the score for any of the pieces, if you were interested, it's probably likely that the first hit that you would get is the guitar version of them. And an example of it is Granada, which you may have heard before, which starts with this, is the first movement of the Suite Espanol. And it starts with a very simple melody in the left hand, and then the right hand has these arpeggios with a harmony. Which I don't know to you, but to me it sounds literally like with a guitar you could literally pluck the strings, as if I did this. But the strings are tuned in a way that it will sound okay if you correctly use your left hand. So that's a very guitar-like writing, for example. There's other movements in the Suite Espanol. The famous one that's has various titles, but Asturias or Leyenda is one of them, which goes like this. It's also very clear. These repeated notes could be in one string, right, in the other one. It's very guitar-like, and especially it becomes much easier actually in a guitar than in a piano when these chords that are interrupting this sort of raindrop-like. It's funny that it's called Asturias. I lived in Asturias for 2 years, and it probably rained 80% of the time. It sounds a little bit like raindrops to me. I don't know what you think. But these chords, when it becomes more spread out, I'm going to try to do it with my mic. Oh. So it starts to open up. You have to go with both hands and be very accurate because if you hit the wrong chord, it will be very obvious and it will sort of destroy the whole flow. So that's another example, and one can keep finding them. In Iberia, you find just elements that are not pianistic written into the piano. The second piece that you will hear, which is called El Puerto, the harbor, has a lot of castanet sounds. You've probably all heard these instruments that are used. You use your hands and you close it, and it looks kind of like a seashell or something that would make this sound. Or you would hit the floor with these special shoes that make a very sharp sound. And this music is full of that with these accents. There's, for example, these elements. Or sounds very Spanish immediately, right? And it's wonderfully depicted for the piano into this wooden box. So I think that speaks a lot to Albeniz's genius in composing. So we'll hear three pieces, as I mentioned briefly, for the sake of time. And the first one is going to be Granada, which you heard a little bit of. And I'll just give you an idea of it. Maybe actually the whole thing we made time for. And so forth. It repeats a few times. But thank you. I find this actually a very moving piece with very, very simple means. It's basically a melody, a chord, and just playing between the major and the minor. But the way that it's done is what actually matters, like in all of music. You can have a very strong concept, but if you don't know how to write it well with very few means, it doesn't speak so well. So yeah, and actually it's also very touching to play this music for me because it always brings you back to your childhood to a certain degree, and that's because of how charged this music is with the culture and sort of subconscious in Spain. If anything could be said of Albeniz as a criticism is that that's a little bit like Chopin, sort of his only, he wrote mostly for the piano, he wrote orchestral things too, but it's all very, very Spanish. Like you wouldn't expect to find a sonata in that traditional form maybe, or other forms, but rather his best works are dances and Spanish songs in collections, like an album that's represent Spain in one way or another. So speaking of that, we will transition to Iberia, and something I found interesting, also talking about Mike and Paris, it's true that someone said, I forgot who said this, that the best Spanish music is written by French composers, which was true until maybe the beginning of the 20th century or a little bit before that. And a lot of Spanish composers went to Paris, or I think Albeniz to Brussels for a while too, and but they'll have to go north in order to come back down. And funnily enough, Messiaen, out of all people, when he saw Iberia for the first time, that's Olivier Messiaen, the French composer, he famously said that this work is the marvel of piano, and it occupies perhaps the highest place between the most brilliant, trying to translate, shows for this the king of instruments by excellence. So basically saying that it occupies the highest point between piano suites. That could be, of course, contended, but certainly for the 20th century, it's probably the most significant or one of the most significant piano suites, which is saying a lot if you consider that that's when Ravel and Debussy were also around writing Miroirs and Images and all these legendary works that are still played. So it's definitely a very significant work. So the first one of the whole set is called Evocación, which, as you guessed, means evocation. And it's, yeah, it's hard to describe. It's such an incredible way to start a suite like this. It's kind of a timeless piece. It's also hard to describe. And it represents Albeniz in a way that one can see after too, that his music is never one-dimensional. So if something is major, there's always a tinge of something a little bit more melancholic and vice versa. And in this case, it's a very slow movement that's just evoking sort of sounds and feelings from Spain. But then there's these echoes of dances in the background that are not quite present, but that you can sort of hear as if you were taking a walk or something and just observing it from a distance. This whole movement has sort of a feeling of observing something from a distance, and it's very abstract, and music is very abstract, so I think it's perfect for to be played in this instrument. And these dances are the fandanguillo, the fandango, which is a Spanish dance. You can sort of hear them in the background. And I think this movement merits being played in its entirety.
Albert and I were talking about would have been great is to have brought on during that piece a flamenco dancer. Because we both agree one of the great experiences musically in Spain today and back then was the interchange between a flamenco dancer and a flamenco guitarist. And then the rhythm section, which is, it can be a drummer there, with a little hand drum, but it's the audience. And it's like they all are doing the different counter rhythms. And it's just like part of their nature. It's just really an incredible, visceral experience. So moving on to a colleague of Albeniz, Enrique Granados, who was born in the same decade as Albeniz. Like his colleague, Albeniz, he was a gifted pianist and went to Paris as well to study at the Paris Conservatoire, but he later dropped out. His most important work that we will hear are the selections from Las Goyescas. The suite of 7 works in 2 books was an immediate success and was commissioned by the Paris Opera to rewrite the work as an opera, which he did. World War I breaks out, and the premiere is held in New York City at the Metropolitan Opera in 1916. And later, Granados will play the piano suite for Woodrow Wilson in the White House. What's interesting is I went and checked, and I hadn't thought that the Metropolitan Opera had performed this piece again since its premiere in 1916. And I'm right. They never have brought it back on stage, which is a real shame. It's a beautiful little opera. Like I say, it consists of 2 books, but what was the big stimulus for this piece? It's called Las Goyescas, or from Goya. And it was around 1897, was I think the 150th anniversary of Goya's birth. And by the way, it wasn't just Goya that was taking back the attention of the art market. At the same time, artists and dealers were discovering Velázquez and El Greco. But these are 3 examples of, some of these are paintings based on a drawing, some of them are actual paintings by Goya. But Goya's work, especially in his etchings, takes a very, very dark, somber tone. I mean, he went through the what they call the Peninsula Wars when France invaded Spain, and there was just huge, horrible atrocities. And Goya eventually puts himself in self-exile in southern France. And interesting enough, Goya and Beethoven share not only almost the same birth and death years, but they both go deaf. Interesting. I mean, of course, for a musician, going deaf is much greater of a consequence than for an artist. If we can raise the screen again, because Albert will take it from here and explain his experience with Las Goyescas and some of the pieces. To play the whole 7 works would be over an hour. And it's rarely, rarely done. Probably Albert's first experience, and mine, as probably some of you in the audience, was a late 1970s recording by Alicia de Rocha, again, a famous pianist from Barcelona. And I don't think anybody had recorded the whole Goyescas before that. And it was a great hit, a great hit. And so it's always been inspiration for other future Spanish pianists to tackle this piece. And it's massive. It's a huge undertaking. Albert.
Great. Yes. So as Mike very well introduced, it's exactly that. This piece. So it was created, I think, just a little bit after Iberia. Like I'm talking about months or a few years. So it was between 1909 and 1911, and it was actually premiered by Granados himself on the piano. He was an incredible pianist and also improviser. Famously, much like Beethoven, he could sit at the piano and entertain people for for an hour, and this sort of describes this music actually quite well. There seems to be always these hidden threads, but it goes in unexpected directions. You think it's going to go in 4 possible ways, and it finds the 5th one somehow always to surprise you. A funny thing, so this connects to the composers we looked at, because in 1909, Granados actually visited Albeniz only a few days before his death. And I think Granados had always seen Albeniz as sort of an older brother figure. So when Albeniz's widow commissioned him to write a piece, Granados was more than honored, and he wrote Azulejos, which is another famous work of him. But with Goyescas, so Granados himself actually said that he intended to make a personal statement in a mixture of petulance and grace, rhythm, color, and life that are typically Spanish, a feeling at once amorous and passionate, dramatic and tragic, as may be observed in the works of Goya. So that, yeah, it's better to quote him than me. So that's what the work should more or less embody. And a funny thing, now that you mentioned Alicia de la Rocha, actually, Alicia de la Rocha studied in an academy that used to exist in Barcelona, which was very famous, called the Marshall Academy, founded by Frank Marshall, a phenomenal pianist with maybe British background, but who settled in Spain. And actually, Frank Marshall, I recently discovered that he actually studied with Granados himself, hence the direct line, and not just, I mean, literally like a 2-step line, which is amazing. And Marshall was a great fan of this piece of Granados, particularly. But going to Goya, actually the reason I became, let's say, infatuated with this piece is not just, it is Alicia de la Rocha's recording, but it's also an opportunity I had very recently in Chicago, in the Art Institute. When I was there, I had some friends who had access, and they thought, he's Spanish, let's show him the Goya prints. And at that time, I didn't know what the Goya prints really were in reference to Goya's life. But I was completely shocked by what I saw. If you haven't seen them, you can Google them. It's incredible. And I didn't realize how significant they were in Goya's life. As Mike said, he went deaf at some point in his life, and he also suffered of a severe illness, and we don't really know in retrospect what it was. It could have been from lead poisoning to syphilis. We don't know, one of those. But Goya's style changed dramatically in that point. Before that, his oil on canvas paintings were famous. His subject matter was different than after he went through all of this, where he started with these etchings, the prints, and to depict much darker and sarcastic and very sort of, well, it's actually, this music is probably the best way to describe his prints in a way. Someone wrote that he became markedly more interested in the grim everyday reality of Spain and the Spanish people, and his characters often twisted, grizzled, and contorted depictions of the poor, the ignorant, or the insane, arguably reflected the mounting social tensions between old Black Spain of tradition and superstition, and the modernizing influence and increasingly rationalizing Europe. So that's a very big sort of statement, but that's why Goya is actually so important historically too. He's said to be the last of the great masters and the first of the moderns, which I think is a very neat quote, because if you look at both styles, so the prince would be more in the first of the modern side of things. And what's quite amazing about this work is that it started to have some social influence. It actually transcended just art in itself, but there's an incredible print where here's where it connects to what we said at the beginning with the Duchess of Alba, the woman who had the castle that went from Madrid to Sevilla, or the castle properties that you could walk through. She's also famous recently in Spain because she was a very public figure. So Granados, with the Duchess of Alba of the time, was Goya was infatuated with the Duchess of Alba, and they had, we don't know if an affair or what was going on, but then she rejected him, and he was so heartbroken that it was another element that led to his change of style. And you can see his very cynical attitude towards relationships in general, also in his prints. There's one, for example, where he depicts a a woman, a maja, what would be called, sort of giving the hand to this very ugly and unpleasant-looking, very old man. And then there's this little quote that he added saying something like, the girl just bends her hand to the first man that comes around or something like that. Like very, and there's this almost dehumanizing nature to a lot of the characters he portrays, both men and women. He portrayed a lot of prostitutes. And for example, there's some nightmarish depictions of some monsters carrying some babies away or something. And he said, the dream of reason creates monsters, which is, as an artist that he was, or to any artist that sort of has a certain philosophical relevance. And so it gives a lot to think about. And I'm sure Granados was, in one way or another, moved by the experience of these prints. Goya himself actually had to flee Spain in fear of being, I don't know, beheaded or something very bad that could have happened to him. And he then also released some quotes that are contradictory and that seem to cover his tracks, and so it's hard to read too much into it. But one of the greatest testaments to Goya's work is Goyesca. So I'm going to play Requiebros, which is the first scene of the opera where the majos, actually there's no cynicism there, and it's the beginning of a sort of relationship between two characters. In the end of the opera, the man dies in a duel because he's jealous, and the woman, I don't know what happens to her, but it's a very tragic ending, unsurprisingly. And that happens in El Amor y la Muerte, which the central section 2 I'm going to also play because it's a really, really beautiful melody, and it got taken, I don't know if ripped, but taken for this Velázquez, one of the most famous Latin pop music melodies called Bésame Mucho, but I think it's Conchita Velázquez. So if Granados was alive today and he had royalties, he would probably be living in Malibu or something like that. It's very, very, very interesting too. Tomorrow in the concert, you'll hear the whole movement. Now this tonadilla would come into the piece, which is a popular Spanish song, and he just introduces it out of the blue. I'll just play the beginning of the melody. And out of this simple scale melody, he develops the whole next section. So the next phrase would go a little bit higher up. All the way to the G, and back down. The next phrase is very simple. Just takes this idea and then keeps going. Started here, it goes all the way to the top. So the reason I'm demonstrating this is that the same phrase happens 3 times, and it's actually not a very complex development of it, but it's very smart and very natural, and it actually sounds like if someone was improvising. That's the first thing that you would do. If someone sang me a melody and I had to improvise on it, in the popular melody, I don't know, I Will Survive or whatever. You start playing it, and then you have time to think a little bit. You start playing and go a little bit further and have time to think. And then by the time you do it the 3rd time, you sort of have an idea of where you're going to go, and you plant the seed for the next step. And that's how a lot of this music is built, which is why it sounds so, it's strangely Wagnerian to me, or Straussian, like German in how it develops and the chromaticism of it. So before we have our fellow musicians on stage, I'll play just an excerpt of another movement of Goyesca's, which is actually my probably my favorite, even though it's not so often played. And what I like about it is how it builds tension throughout the 10 minutes that sadly we're not going to hear today, but and it alternates between 2 chords. I think it's incredibly well written between this and then this chord, which is a very nice chord. It's just a German 6th, but everything that happens around it is very beautiful. So I'll just play a little excerpt of the beginning of the end. It's so beautiful. I think, yeah. Anyway.
And tomorrow night, we'll hear the whole thing. But we've only got so much time tonight. And as you know, Granados, we could go be here for all night. We can bring the screen down. And I'm going to jump a little ahead now. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have 4 art songs done by Holly and Johnson, and Holly and Christopher can come on the stage. There. Let me get your music stand. We have a selection of 4 songs, and the first composer is Montsalvatge, who is from Barcelona. Later on, Albert will play a piece of his, and then the composer I mentioned earlier, Frederic Mompou, we'll be hearing a song of his. It means the fight for sleep, and then followed by 2 songs by Manuel de Falla, which is from a collection of folk songs, and they're very simple, very basic. You almost feel like you hear them in a street in Sevilla. So if we can raise the screen, again, sorry, and let Holly and Christopher present the 4 songs. Thank you. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Christopher. Especially with that last song. The Falla is from southern Spain, from Andalusia, which, as I said in my opening remarks, was ruled by the Moors for over 700 years. And you definitely can hear the Middle Eastern, North African mood and harmony coming in from these songs, which the Falla definitely grew up hearing flamenco and these works all around him. We can bring the screen down again, please. And I will start talking about Manuel de Falla, and then from then we'll talk about then Frederic Mompou, and then finish up the program with Albert playing some selections from those composers. Manuel de Falla was born in, like I said, in Andalusia, but like the other Spanish composers, he went to Paris after he stayed for a while in Madrid. And in Paris, he has a great success. Within a few years, he's commissioned by Diaghilev to write music for a ballet. His works were premiered by fellow Spaniard Ricardo Viñas, who was the pianist who debuted Ravel's famous Gaspard de la Nuit. And de Falla today is known a lot for his ballets and small operas, La Vida Breve, El Amor Brujo, which was made into a film, Three-Cornered Hat, which has been well known on stage and in film. One of his big promoters on piano was Arthur Rubinstein. At the outbreak of World War I, de Falla leaves Paris, never to return. He lives for a while in Madrid, then goes and lives in Andalusia, especially during the Civil War. While he had studied in Madrid, and then later on when he's living in Andalusia, he was very good friends with Garcia Lorca. In the picture to your right is from a newspaper article, and Garcia Lorca is the man with the white shirt to your very left. And then Manuel de Falla is the man to the farthest to your right, wearing a cap. And typically, if you don't have much hair, you wear a cap, especially back then. De Falla survives the Civil War, and unfortunately, he probably wasn't too far from where Lorca was picked up by the Phalangists and assassinated and put into an unmarked grave. After the war's end, de Falla moves to Buenos Aires. What's interesting is during his self-exile in Buenos Aires, the Franco government offered him a huge pension if he would come back to live in Spain, because he was representative of Spanish music at that time. De Falla refused, and it showed that though he never spoke out publicly about the Civil War, this is where he showed his principles. I'm sorry, I am going in the wrong direction here. So then the next composer we will finish off with is Frederic Mompou, born in Barcelona, again goes to Paris. Unlike de Falla, he returns to Paris after World War I and is championed by Satie, by Poulenc. He probably would have had a great career even as a pianist, but he was very introverted. He could not stand crowds, he could not stand attention. And so though he was a very talented pianist, he could not pursue that as a career. When he finally returns to Spain, he lives a very quiet life in Barcelona. What's interesting, his production for his whole lifetime, and he lived a long life into the 1980s. He only composed about 200 works. The only other example of a great composer with such a little output is Maurice Ravel. So if we can bring the light down on the piano and raise the screen, Albert will welcome you back to the piano. And I know I should be finishing up now, but if you still have a little more patience with us, We'll give you a few selections from Mompou. Albert and I were actually talking about he might show an example of the flamboyance that Arthur Rubinstein did with one of the famous pieces of the Falla, the Dance of Fire, Danza de Fuego. And then we'll finish up. But the next couple pieces, did it work or did it break?
I think it still works. We'll find out if I fall. No, it's great. I sit very low and I feel bad for having made it. Thank you so much, Mike. Great. So, since we don't have so much time left, just briefly about Xavier Monsalvatge, who was like, actually we heard some beautiful De Falla, so I encourage you all to, this order is very confusing, to go on YouTube on your own time and watch Arthur Rubinstein play La Danza del Fuego. It's a black and white clip of a live concert. And we both admire Rubinstein a lot. He had this incredible stage presence, and we were talking about how short he was and yet how big he became on stage. But we were both laughing. I remember watching this for the first time and being puzzled and kind of very amused at this passage in the Danza del Fuego where he always had this sort of, in his era, it's a little bit maybe in the tradition of even of Liszt and of a little bit of showmanship in concerts. And there's a moment where there's this, I don't know exactly how it goes, but something like an alternating. And we were both puzzled at how high he makes his hands go. It literally looks like a dinosaur chasing something. It goes like way above his head, but with a speed, I tried to imitate it at the piano and my fingers would start bleeding if I did this for more than 10 seconds because it's literally, it already hurts just from doing it. So he had an incredible strength at the tip of his fingers. I think Pollini, actually, rest in peace, he passed away recently, says that when he won the Chopin competition, Rubinstein was in the jury. And so Rubinstein congratulated Pollini and all of that and said, bravo. And then he showed him how he got his sound that everyone talks about, the Rubinstein sound, which sort of pierced and had this presence to the hall. Apparently Rubinstein went to Pollini's back and he did this. And it hurt a lot. It had a lot of strength and he had these incredible knuckles. So it's something actually incredible to witness. So I encourage you all to go on YouTube and watch that. With Monsalvatge, I guess we see a Catalan composer who, at the beginning of his life, was into serialist 12-tone music, almost in the Schoenberg tradition. Then at some point, he became fascinated with the music from the Caribbean, Netherlands, Antilles, and changed his style. This reminds me a little bit of some of the Spanish visual artists who had like primitivism in their art and the influence of those figures. And I think his fascination was with the traditional tribes that were there before they were occupied or whatever the case may have been. And then after went into a sort of polytonality, where that means there's two tonalities at the same time or more going on in the same music, but there's still tonality. So we all know very briefly what tonality is. It's just a sort of a key center that it's all based on. If I played very clearly, the key is C major, or if I did a minor one, that's F sharp minor. So imagine having those at the same time. So my right hand would be in F sharp minor, and then the left hand is going to be in C major. It's not atonal. There's actually keys. It's just two keys, and it sounds he maneuvers that very well and very artfully. So that's something I love about his music. And then finally with Mompou, I think it's kind of a nice way to end this program. Mike introduced him beautifully already, but I don't know that there's much that can be said about him to describe him except his music, because he was such a reclusive person, and I think I read that it was a changing point in his life to hear Fauré play some of his music live. And there's some of that, I was thinking what they have in common, and it's a little bit, this certain naive and very direct attitude towards writing, it's like seeing the world for the first time, or with no sort of artificial, it's a certain purity, which everyone expresses in the same way, and that I actually find Schumann also has. It's so vulnerable, and it's a completely crazy world, but he sort of he pours his soul as it is, without any sort of taming of any sort. And not to get too philosophical, but it's interesting. Mompou actually has a set called Música Callada, which means silent music. It's already an oxymoron, is what it would be called. But and he said something about it's music that's not meant to be played, but it's some sort of internal music that you hear in your head. And I was thinking that it's interesting that Schumann actually, I remember playing his Humoresque. For those of you who know the Schumann Humoresque, an incredibly beautiful piece that starts. With beautiful harmonies. There's a movement in it in which he writes a melody, but it's an inner melody, which is incredible. It's not meant to be played, and everything around it is the accompaniment to that melody, but actually the voice does not play it, it's actually the main melody, so you only hear the accompaniment, but it's music that's inside of you. And Mompou also had that with this set, and with pretty much everything he wrote. I feel like there's a certain intimacy that's almost perverse to play it in a concert hall or to even play it for you. It's sort of a very private but very contemplative experience. He himself, I found this beautiful quote where he said, the best word is the unspoken word. As all know, I am a man of few words and a composer of few notes. Music is written for the inexpressible. It should seem to come out of the shadow in order to move back into the shadow. I find myself forced to find new paths. I don't think I could ever enclose my music in the correct world, which I think is beautiful. So there's this piece which is called El Lago, which is the lake, out of a set of sort of depictions that I find encapsulated his style well. So I'm going to try to play some of it. And then maybe to finish with a slightly brighter tone, one of his canciones y danzas, which means song and dance. And he took, Mompou is perhaps actually more Catalan than Spanish in his style, in that he took the Catalan traditional songs and dances and put them into music. And this is one of them. So these are songs that you learn in elementary school that talk about things that little kids would talk about, which again shows the innocence in his style. And it's just beautiful, beautiful music. I think it's interesting with Mompou, people who appreciate him are really, really in love with his music, and because it sort of feels something that no other composer really manages to. It's a completely unique composer in music history, perhaps close to Satie, but even we were talking about it a little bit in our emails, even different than Satie in that it's maybe even less self-conscious, or not really trying to achieve anything for the sake of anything. So yes, this is The Lake by Mompou.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I forgot to say, actually, I believe there's on YouTube even an album of Mompou himself playing all of these canciones y danzas and preludes, and it's a beautiful recording because it's a more modern recording, so it's a very high quality thing. So if you want some more of this, yeah, quite powerful music in a very sort of strange way.
No, and there's other songs as well that are just very dear. What's interesting is we talked earlier, Albert and I, that Mompou wrote a lot of the songs in Catalan, and at a certain point it was against the law to speak Catalan in Spain. It was prohibited. So he sort of made a political statement in that way, but otherwise he was fairly quiet. If we can bring down the screen, I just have one closing slide to sort of represent the pinnacle of Spain in this period. And in 1929, Barcelona hosted a world exposition, invited countries from around the world to do an exhibit of their country's movement in culture, architecture, industry. And this is the German submission. It's called the Barcelona Pavilion. And the architect is Mies van der Rohe, who is one of the leading teachers at the Bauhaus School in Germany. This is the Weimar Republic of Germany. This is just before the modern age is going to have a very huge wake-up. It's not the democratic republics that will be leading the charge. It will be the fascist dictatorships. And I end the program here. Spain, in the next decade, will be going through, it's probably one of the most horrible histories any country can go through, its civil war. And the country is still coming to grips to understand what had happened. There was atrocities on both sides. And the result, of course, was the dictatorship of Franco. But at this moment, there's this great hope, this great modernism that you see here with the Barcelona Pavilion and what they call the Barcelona chair. If I can have Holly and Christopher and Albert please come and give everybody the final applause.